Oh, I'm sorry. Did I just miss that?
No, you didn't.
Hi,
You,
this is Bjorn Lomborg. This is the Break It Down show.
that's right. We got Bjorn Lomborg on the show because look, I'm like you. I'm an environmentalist, but I hold these are big problems, man, and they don't tolerate a bunch of halfway thinking and a bunch of siloed thinking. And God bless all of you PhD folks, but as a group, you tend to silo and lose sight of other things, and so the conversations become more combative and not as healthy as they might need to be. And I appreciate that you're someone who kind of battles that. So let me also say this for the audience. You guys should all go listen to last week's episode with Tom Gilligan, the day that Bjorn's new book dropped, and it's called False Alarm. Tom does a great laydown of the book. And so I want to kind of use that as a part one. And so we'll cover more things than that. So go watch that show. It's fantastic. Tom does a great job with what Bjorn's doing. My favorite line from the whole book: climate change is not the only problem facing the world, nor is it the largest. This is important, but I want to kind of, before we get too far into this, I want to do a bona fides section, because all of these things, they quickly become a problem. Like I'm up front saying I'm an environmentalist. I want to be a good steward of the earth, all these are the things, but I want to do it rationally, sensibly. And I believe we agree on this. Yet when you used to make all these like top 500, top 50, top, whatever influencers, and then something changed and you became an outsider, even though you're doing the same work and you're probably better at it, I'm assuming. So I want to kind of go into the bona fides part and just establish, the Copenhagen Consensus Center, all the fantastic work you've done. Why has the level of critique risen, especially like when you're referencing people like Dr. Nordhaus, who's a Nobel-winning economist who talks about the economy and climate? When you're talking about Paul Kent, who's a geomorphologist, or Arthur Webb, these are people that Arthur Webb's been cited 1,000 times on geomorphology, which is, for the people listening, I'll let Bjorn explain it. But you're citing fantastic people when you do your research, and yet there's still this contentious argument that often focuses on not academics, but like your sanity in some of the critique I've seen. Help us understand the bona fides and where you're at with all that stuff.
So, fundamentally, the work that I do with the Copenhagen Consensus, we work with more than 300 of the world's top economists, 7 Nobel laureates in economics. I think everyone recognizes that what we're trying to do is something that's both important and useful. And that's basically saying, look, lots of problems in the world. We don't have resources to fix everything. So where should we start? What kind of places can we spend $1 and help the world the most? That's not a crazy question. That's actually a very, very important question. And we try to come up with answers. Look, we're not the only ones doing that. And we're certainly not the right answer, and there's no other answer, but this is certainly one of the answers that you should be listening to. When I do my work on climate change, as you just pointed out, I cite Nordhaus. I take much of my starting point with him. He is the only climate economist in the world to get the Nobel Prize for climate economics. So it's not like this is a crazy outlying point. This is, I would argue, exactly mainstream climate economics. And when I talk about climate, I cite almost entirely the UN climate panel, which is also what everybody focuses on. So I think the difference is really that there's a lot of people who would like you to believe that things are a lot worse. I think a lot of these people actually believe that things are a lot worse, and it's incredibly inconvenient. And I'm pretty sure we'll get through to some of these points. But it's incredibly inconvenient that, for instance, Nordhaus and many others point out that the net impact of global warming by, say, 2100 is going to be, say, 3-4% of GDP. That means it's a problem. That also means it's not the end of the world. And their sense, and the way that almost everyone talk each other into this frenzy about global warming, is it's almost the end of the world. And so clearly, if you cite 3 to 4%, which, by the way, is based on all the period evidence studies, and which is what the UN put forward. And it's not just Nordhaus, it's all the major IEMs that find this. So all of this is sort of standard knowledge, but it doesn't fit our understanding of this. And I think that's why people will attack me. And quite frankly, I think that's also why a lot of people would like to silence me. So I think the fact, what you just mentioned, I've been on Times 100 list. I've been on lots of these other lists. And you're absolutely right. I'm not on those lists anymore. And I think one of the things is it's much easier to just ignore than to actually have that debate. So I don't think it's an attempt to try to silence me as much as just, oh, let's not talk about that, because that's actually difficult because he uses evidence.
Yeah, I've got a lot of time in conflict zones. You probably aren't aware of any of this stuff, and I've watched how our government here in the U.S. has tried to create stability and normalcy in other places, and it's very tough to do because you stack multiple systems into multivariate problems, and to make a good outcome come out the other end of that maze, it's damn near impossible. And I'll say this too, because I know we're going to talk about this. I've eaten, a matter of fact, I've cooked a meal in Afghanistan that I cooked on cardboard inside, So when we talk about these climate things, I've seen it firsthand. Like, yeah, this is their fuel. It's poop. It's cardboard. It's leftover whatever. And when I mean whatever, plastic, anything, So these problems that you say, like, it's not the only problem, Yeah, like poverty is I think a significantly bigger problem. Let's talk a little bit about that. But one more thing, I want to make a point about something too, in the book, and I want to make sure you just come around and grab this. At one point, you talk about sort of the tropes of climate change, and it's the polar bears. Which literally, there was a story yesterday about polar bears dying off in less than 100 years, and yet you citing the data that it does not appear to be true. But also, I watched. I'm going to hit him on the head right here. Dr. Billy Pizer from Duke talks about heat deaths and fires and flooding and all of these things that are sensational and terrifying when you see the fires in Southern California where I live. But the reality is something totally different. So kind of just grab all of that stuff and just give us your thoughts on how we understand like what's not working, and then like the problems like poverty and how it impacts them too.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First, when we talk about extreme weather, the sense is that things are getting worse and worse and getting out of hand. And that's, if you look at the data, actually just phenomenally untrue. If you look at the number of dead, which is probably the best number we have, we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of dead from natural disasters that are climate related. So we've actually seen a reduction in deaths globally from about 500,000 people dying every year from climate-related deaths. So that's floods, droughts, storms, extreme temperatures. 500,000 people used to die every year on average in the 1920s. Today, that number is down to about 20,000. So we've seen a reduction of about 95%. Remember, at the same time, we've seen population quadruple. So your personal risk, a person's risk of dying from climate-related disasters, has dropped by 99% over the last 100 years. This has very little to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that we've gotten much richer. If you're poor, you're very vulnerable to anything that happens. If you're rich, you're not nearly as vulnerable. So that's mainly a question of saying we are much better able to take care of any problem that might arise. And likewise, when people then look into the future, they say, oh, no, things are going to get much worse. We're going to get much worse storms, much more flooding and all that stuff. Well, actually, if you look at the UN Climate Panel, the US National Assessment and so on, what they find is we cannot say right now that any of these things are driven by climate change. But in the long run, yes, climate change, for instance, will likely make, for instance, hurricanes stronger but fewer. Overall, that turns out to be a net negative because although there are fewer hurricanes, if they become stronger, because that damage will be much greater, that is what will drive it. But here's the point. As we also get richer, we will get much, much less vulnerable. So what it actually turns out is that instead of getting much less vulnerable, we will only get less vulnerable. To put it very bluntly, this is one study from Nature a couple of years ago, the most quoted one. They say right now, global warming costs 0.04%. Sorry, hurricanes cost 0.04% of GDP every year globally. If we didn't have global warming, because we get much richer, that would decline to 0.01. because we have global warming, that will only decline to 0.02.
Huh.
So get this. It means that we will have more damage than if we had no global warming. That's why global warming is a problem. That's why we should start talking about how to fix it. But it's not such that it's getting out of hand. It simply means we will be slightly less vulnerable than we are today. We're going to be in a less better state of the world, which is not quite as terrifying. And that, I think, is the main point to recognize. This, of course, is also why it's so important to remember that while we talk a lot about global warming in the top billion people on the planet who don't lack food and who have good health care and who have reasonable education and all this other stuff, the rest of the world's population actually want those things first. And so when you ask them, they don't come and tell you, I'm sorry, I really care about global warming. No, I care about my kids dying from easily curable infectious diseases, from all these other very simple things first. And if we help them with that, they will also become much better able to tackle global warming.
One of the things too is that the sensational storytelling. Again, it's the polar bear on top of the iceberg. It's the wildfire picture. It's renaming things. How many different names are in there now for a full moon? It's the blue moon. It's the hunter moon. It's the this moon. And then the meteorological terms that have the polar bomb, and like just all these cataclysmic titles for things. We're just selling a lot of this stuff. So, and you and I both know, like, humans are bad at pattern analysis. Like, this is the worst storm ever, and then all you have to do is look and go, actually, not even top 10, like, it's bad. Yeah. And this isn't to say that climate change is not a problem, but we're just so bad at selling this. And another aspect of this that I want to get into is we've had a Dr. Steven running on the show. He's a climatologist out of Montana, and he's very practical. He's like, look, not everybody can ride their bike to work. Some people work 35 miles from their home. So they have to take cars because there isn't a bus that can get them. Like, it's just not realistic. And then instead of it being like the war on drugs or the war on terror or the war on poverty, where you have these stupid terms that have no outcomes, I asked him, like, what are we trying to do? Like, it's really hard to reliably change the climate. Like, our history of, we get better at it, but our history of controlling this thing, it's just not good. And he said, how about capping everything at 400 parts per million with carbon and just working at that goal? And then if we can do that, I think we can. This is him saying this. I think we can manage the rest of the carbon with what's going on. She's like, what I just don't want to see is this up, and never stopping. So help me understand, like, the selling of this climate disaster and then, like, the management of it. Like, is 400, does that seem to follow what you've seen? Or what should the goal be?
Yeah. So two things. There's no doubt that we are hearing ever worse things. I remember for a while being very taken in with all the different kinds of moons, and you got, and they're all like the moon, and there's very much that sense. So if you look at two things, I think that's happened. You very often hear this is the worst storm impact ever, and that's actually often true, but it has almost nothing, or probably nothing, to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that there are many more people close to where hurricanes, for instance, hit, and they have much more expensive homes. So when a hurricane hits, you're going to get much bigger damage. I go through that in the book. It's a well-known example of what's called the expanding bullseye effect. But what it fundamentally means is, look, in Florida in 1900, almost nobody lived there. Since then, the coastal counties of Florida has increased in population 67 times, whereas the U.S. has only increased like 4 times, right? So you have a situation where many, many more people live with much more expensive houses. So, of course, when the same hurricane comes through, it'll simply create a lot more damage. A lot of people then say, see, all that damage, global warming. No, that's actually not what's happening. If you normalize it for the number of people and the wealth of their houses, you don't see an increase. But that's a much harder argument to make. At the same time, you also say we're being told about the future, how that's even more scary. And that's exactly right. We hear this all the time. So one good example last year, Washington Post led with this story, but very many other papers across the US and across the world really had this story from one scientific paper that said, by the end of the century, because of global warming, which will lead to sea level rises, 187 million people will have to move. they'll otherwise get flooded. And not surprisingly, some news organization then jumped the gun and said 187 million people will drown by the end of the century. And this obviously makes for great media. What is the reality? Yes, global warming is real. Yes, it will lead to sea level rise, although it was a very, very high-end estimate of it. But what it also says is, it says all this sea level rise, all the people who are close to getting inundated with this will sit the next 80 years, watch the waves first lap up over their knees and then their hips, and then eventually they'll drown without doing anything. And of course, that is entirely implausible. The very paper who did the 187 million people also said this is unrealistic because in reality we'll adapt, and with realistic adaptation, it's not going to be 187 million people, it's going to be 305,000 people. So 600 times less. Remember, 305,000 people is half the number of people that move out of California every year. I think the world can handle that over an 80-year period. So the idea here is to say one is a catastrophe and a genuine catastrophe and what everybody writes about. The other one is reality. And I think that's the big problem that we have in confronting this. We're told there's more and more damage. No, that's mostly from more people with more stuff. We're told it's going to get ever worse, 187 million people. No, that's because you forgot adaptation. If you bring in those, you get the kind of numbers that Nordhaus, as we started off talking about, will tell you 3-4% cost by the end of the century. That's not trivial, but it's not the end of the world. So you ask, how do we then fix this? I think, first of all, it's not surprising if you ask a climatologist, how should you fix this? He's going to say 400 ppm. Look, most people would have no idea what that means. And it's certainly not a good target to steer by. A little bit like a lot of people and a lot of politicians say we should cap the temperature at 2 degrees centigrade, which is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Most people have no idea what that would mean, and it doesn't translate into anything kind of political. Plus, also, it is very unlikely that the right target is an even round number. So the reality here is we need to start talking about what should you do, realizing that there are costs to not doing something, which is the 3 to 4% by the end of the century. And of course, it's going to get even worse into the 22nd century. But there are also costs to doing something, namely that we have to pay for a lot of less reliable, more costly energy and so forth. That's why we need to have a balancing. There is a good place where we have this balancing all the way. There in US, every year, about 40,000 people die from traffic deaths. We know how to avoid all of them by setting the speed limit at 3 miles an hour, right? But we don't, because we also say we actually like to be able to get home from work and we like to be able to visit our friends and family. We like a continentally integrated economy. So we make decisions where we say, should it be 55 miles an hour or should it be 85 miles an hour? That's a sensible conversation. And in the same way, we need that sensible conversation on climate change saying we should not do nothing, we should not do everything, we should do something in between. And that's what Nordhaus has spent his career on. That's what he actually got the Nobel Prize for. What he shows is if you do something that is put a smaller but not a trivial carbon tax on all goods across not only the US, but across the globe, you will reduce emissions significantly without creating too much economic damage. And so he finds the optimal place where we reduce the most without making much damage. So basically what he finds is instead of 3%, as I mentioned, and this is actually an estimate over the next 500 years, if you reduce by first, you have a carbon tax of about $20, escalate up to about $100. That will actually drive, in total, a reduction of almost 50% of CO2 emissions by the end of the century. It will reduce temperatures by about 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will cost about 0.4 percentage points of GDP, but it'll avoid damage of 0.8 percentage points. So overall, you get a benefit for mankind of 0.4%. percentage points. Notice just how much less exciting what I just told you is than the people who just go out and say, we got to save the planet.
Yeah.
That is a very understandable point, but it's also absolutely impossible. We've been trying for 30 years to just say, let's do 2 degrees, and we've achieved almost nothing. Saying 400 parts per million is a wonderful sort of technocrat solution. I think it's way too low, and it's almost, I mean, it is impossible because we're above 400 now. But moreover, it's just not something that you rationally can implement in any realistic way in a political setting. But what you can do is start talking about these solutions, as I mentioned, carbon tax. And then, of course, we should talk about innovation in green energy.
And let's get into some of the solutions in a minute. But I also want to spend a little more time. I mean, again, like I'm picturing like the newspaper editor at the Washington Post or somewhere. He's got a cigar and he's like, "How many people got to move? 187? Not good enough. Give me 200 million." Like, no, that's too much.
Yes.
We can't. Well, then don't say they got to move. No one cares about that. Say they got to die. Yeah. And his cigar goes in his mouth, and they're like, "Yes, that's what we do." And so they sell this hyperbolic stuff. I mean, we know this happens all the time. That's why the marketing part of the weather has changed so dramatically. But let's talk a little bit about, because look, I'm a combat guy. So when people say that global warming causes Syria to break down, I can't take them seriously, because you have to understand the human condition on the ground there. People who don't have enough things have trapdoors underneath them, and there's always problems. And so, like, when I talk to these young military-age males, they have no hope. They don't care about global warming. They have no hope, and they have no out. And so the first off-ramp that comes, they'll take it, even if it involves killing people. So yeah, sure, climate change is a problem. Syria is going to stay hot for a long time, but let's talk a little bit about the problem of poverty, and then how that's a human problem that, for sure, it has to be tied a little bit to global climate change. But give us some more insight on that, like in the problem of the economics of this whole worldwide problem.
Yep. So there's really 2 things to this. One is, as you mentioned, that in a wide range of different impacts in the world, global warming is undoubtedly one of them. But to say that this caused the Syria civil war is just simply phenomenally simplistic and mostly just false. It has a part. And of course, what you have to remember is, if you buy into the idea that it is part of the reason why you get civil wars, why didn't you get civil wars in the countries that are right next to them? Israel, Jordan, many other places, Lebanon, which also had similar droughts, but didn't have a civil war in any similar kind of way. And of course, also, if you start saying, well, drought is going to deliver more civil war, why would you not then say, because we know that global warming will both create more and less drought, why would you not then say it helped prevent civil wars where it created less drought? Yeah. You can't just pick the bad case, but of course that's your Washington Post, your imagined Washington Post op-ed editor, who will only pick the stories that actually ended up being bad. But more generally, if we look at what actually helps you as a human being, what is the most dangerous thing for almost everyone? That's poverty. If you're in poverty, everything is bad. So when people tell you, and this is one of the things I find really frustrating, they'll tell you global warming will harm the world's poor the most. And this is true. But it is also true for pretty much anything else you can think of when you talk about about being poor. Everything is worse for people who are poor. And so the reality is, their kids die more from easily curable infectious diseases. They have worse school. They have worse healthcare. They have worse nutrition. Everything else is worse. And so the question is, why would you want to say to a mother whose child might not make it through the night because it's going to die from malaria, you're going to tell her, you know what? I really feel your pain. I'm going to help you by not driving to work tomorrow in my car. I'm going to take my bicycle instead. At best, you're simply telling her, I'm going to make a trivial change to the temperature in 100 years to help, if your child survives, their descendants a little bit, instead of helping her right now. That, I think, is one of the big problems of the hypocrisy in this conversation. This is not to say, we're an advanced civilization. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do several things, but we need to get our sense of priorities right. And so when the UN went out and asked in connection with the last time they did an update of the global goals, they asked, what are your priorities to about 10 million people across the world? And they gave them 16 different opportunities. So one was climate change, one was nutrition, one was better jobs, one was healthcare, so on. And what they very overwhelmingly said was, we want better education, we want better health, we want more nutrition. At the very bottom of 16 of 16 was climate. And what that tells you is not that they don't care about climate, but when your kids are dying, you don't care about 100 years from now. And again, we're in this fortunate position where we can actually afford to care about multiple things. But let's not, which I think is very much what's happening right now, only care about global warming because that's sort of the big thing right now, and forget about poverty, forget about lack of nutrition and education and all these other things that also need fixing and that will do much, much more good. Again, remember, if you make very poor people slightly less poor, not only is it fantastic for them in all kinds of other humanitarian ways, it actually also means that they will be less vulnerable to climate change. And it turns out that for the very poorest people, the best climate approach, even if you don't care about anything but climate, the best climate approach is actually to help them become more prosperous.
You're looking at a picture, everybody, if you're watching live, of the border. Which this is the island of Hispaniola, and on the green side, well, that's the Dominican Republic, and on the left is Haiti. And so, like, here we have this, like, neither place is teeming with money, but you look at just the quality. This is in the tropics, everybody, and there is basically a desert on one side of this island, and this is the representation that Bjorn's talking about with poverty and what it looks like. These folks have had to survive. They've had to chop down damn near every tree on their part of the island. It's shocking. And so if we're going to do a global change, here's a good test. At least I would say, like, there's a good lab right here, right? Like, can we reliably make this a better place in terms of its contribution to the world and balance? What are your thoughts on that, Bjorn?
Well, so one part of this particular picture is also that the Dominican Republic simply have better regulation, but it's definitely also a fact that people have much more access to energy. So if you have access to energy, you don't need to go out and chop down the last forests. And that's what they do in much of Haiti. So we actually did a big project in Haiti looking at where can you spend an extra dollar and do the most good together with the Haitian government. And one of the things we found was nutrition, for instance, is incredibly important, but also just simply reforming, for instance, the electricity sector. The electricity sector, despite the fact that there's almost no electricity available to most people in Haiti, very unlike the Dominican Republic, they still spend about 10% of their GDP on subsidizing, 10% of the public, of the government spending on an incredibly ineffective electricity sector. And this is one of the frustrating things, and this, of course, is much of the problem with why it's really hard to be poor, that everything works much, much less effectively than it could. And that's why, again, we need to be very careful to not say the problem these people have is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, it probably is in the grand order of things if you take into account everything. But no, the big problems right now is their kids are dying, that they have very little money, that they have very little opportunity. There's so many other problems that are just so much more important.
One of the big data points I got out of all my time working in conflict zones as a spy was a farmer said to me, you're America, this is a rock. I can literally light the dirt in my backyard on fire because there's energy in it. There's so much oil in the ground. And yet we don't have a high tension wire electricity transferring system here in this country. You guys have spent $1 trillion. We could have done that first. And then he said the most powerful words ever. He said, how long would your government operate without electricity? and
Yep.
it's just like mind blowing. You think about that. Yeah. So in a place that has no electricity, how can you create stability? And yeah, maybe the world will be in a worse place climate change wise, but the people right now today that don't have even electricity to get education, to go somewhere, it's shocking. I wanted to talk a little bit too about. Like I'm a big fan of Tesla. My daughter, I bought her 50 shares of stock before it was $50 even. But we also, you and I
Smart.
both know, and Dr. Running agrees, like the cost of an electric car is not what you think, especially with the way us Americans, at least, how we just chew through consumables. Like had that car for 3 years, out the door, new car. So talk a little bit about the cost for these things that appear to be carbon neutral, but in fact are probably on par. I would guess, I don't know, but on par with a regular automobile.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of studies done, for instance, for the electric car. Actually, electric cars are typically better climate-wise. So, over its lifetime, an electric car will probably emit about 9 tons of CO2 less than what a similar gasoline-driven car will emit. And to give you a sense of proportion, so right now we subsidize those with about $10,000, depending a little bit which state you live in, but a lot of money. And of course, we also give them free access to the high occupancy lanes and all kinds of other goodies along that line. But $10,000 to achieve 9 tons of CO2 reduction. If you spent that money on just any old carbon trading system, so take the Reggie in the Northeast, you could achieve the same amount of reduction for $50. Why are we not just cutting it with $50 and then get it over with? That would leave $9,950 over for all other good things. We could either cut a lot more CO2, or we could also, have better pandemic preparedness. We could have, better healthcare systems or better schools or whatever you'd like. The point here again is to get a sense of proportion. And I think this is what often happens in sort of the American debate, especially, but very much also in the environmental debate in general, that you have these people who say, electric cars is a salvation. This is what's going to solve everything. And then you have on the other side who says, electric cars don't work at all. They're just as bad or even worse kind of thing. Well, they're a little good, but they cost a fantastic amount of money at a little good. And so what we need to recognize is electric cars at best is going to be a tiny bit of a solution in 10, 20, 30 years from now. Again, it's reasonable to assume that electric cars will actually be as cheap or cheaper in about 10 years than gasoline cars, simply because battery costs coming down dramatically. By that time, people who regularly need a car just to go a limited number of miles will buy such a car. People who don't want it, who wants to sometimes be able to go for a long ride, will probably still buy a hybrid, and hybrid is probably actually the better outcome. But we need to get a sense of proportion. Even when they are much cheaper, they will still only solve a very small part of the problem. So right now, the world has about 5 million electric cars. The International Energy Agency estimates, even if we phenomenally manage to get 320 million cars, electric cars on the road by 2030, it will reduce total CO2 emissions by 0.1%. Wow. So we need to get a sense of proportion. Yes, it's nice. Tesla is lovely. One of my friends has one. I love to try, to try it out. But this is not what's going to save the planet.
Mary asked a question. Let me pull this question up again. She asks about the, like in her case, Deal Island out in the east coast of the United States, but just in general, the island, like all these things are going to be underwater soon. But you've got a lot of insight. Again, the doctors that work on that stuff we referenced earlier, geomorphologists, talk a little bit about that, and then we're really going to go into what will work. So go ahead and
yes.
Talk to us about geomorphology.
So I'm not going to get into the Deal Island because unfortunately I don't even know where it is. I'm going to claim European
it's
here.
All good.
Yeah. But the general point is the idea: sea levels are going to rise, and so everything is going to be more threatened with sea level rise. It is true that is going to be a harder problem than if we didn't have sea level rise. And of course, in some of those places, like her island, if you also have that the island themselves are sinking probably from the last ice age, that's an added problem. But it's nothing we haven't fixed before. And Holland, obviously, is the premier example. 40% of Holland is below sea level. The world's 14th largest airport is the former site of a naval battle. It is, it is substantially underwater, and they built it up. And nobody, if you go there, nobody notices. It's not to say that it's free. It is something that obviously Holland would rather not have to pay for, but it is not very costly. And so almost all places around the world will be able to defend themselves at very low cost, typically, unless you're on a very small island. And again, that may be the case for this particular island. But unless you're on a very small island, the cost is going to be less than 0.1% of your GDP. So it is certainly something you're going to do. Even at the worst case scenarios, we estimate that 96% of all valuables and 90% of all places with human habitation are going to be preserved, and very likely much higher numbers, simply because it's very cheap to do. There's lots of political interest and also financial interest to do it, and we have 80 years to do so. So the fundamental point here is the economics tell us this is at best a challenge, one that we've handled very, very well in the past when we were much poorer and had much less technology. And so it seems inconceivable that we would not be able to handle it as we get much richer and will be much better able to handle it.
Okay, let's talk for the last few minutes here about what you think will work. And by the way, everybody should go get False Alarm. There it is on my phone. You see that I've got it. It's fantastic. I've read the whole thing. It's just insightful, and it's good just to be able to have sane conversations. So I definitely highly recommend it. 5 stars. What is the value? Where is it at? Like, what do we need to be doing?
So the fundamentally most important solution is technology. So if you think back to Los Angeles in the 1950s, 60s, terribly polluted, right, mostly from cars. And the simple sort of environmentalist solution would be to say, I'm sorry, you can't drive your car. You got to stop doing that. And if everybody had stopped using their car, yes, Los Angeles would have been a lot cleaner. It would probably also have been impossible. So the real solution was the innovation of the catalytic converter. That means you can still drive your car, and you can still have lots of remember, there are many other problems with driving a car, which is mostly traffic accidents and congestion, and they still have that. You'll still have that with a Tesla as well, right? So it doesn't solve those problems, but it solves the main problem of pollution. So now you can have many more people drive many more cars, much more, and have much lower pollution. The point here is, don't try to tell people, I'm sorry, you got to do without, which is always going to be hard and probably not work. Tell them, here's a technological solution. How do you do that for climate? Fundamentally, the problem is that climate-friendly solutions are more expensive than fossil fuel. If they were cheaper, we'd all be doing them. So the reality is, how do we get people to do more green and less fossil fuels? You do that by innovating the price of green energy down. We have not been very good at focusing on that. What we have been doing is strongly subsidizing existing and typically inefficient solar panels and wind turbines. So we put them up, we give them a lot of subsidies, we feel good about ourselves, but it solves very, very little. Globally, solar and wind contributes just over 1% of global energy consumption today. So it is a very trivial part, and it's likely to stay pretty much that at least until 2040. But if we invest lots more in research and development in green energy, we can drive the price down of some sort of green energy. Now, this might be solar and wind with lots and lots of batteries, but it might not be. It could also be fourth generation nuclear power. Remember, fourth generation, that's the kind of thing that Bill Gates and others are investing in. Right. They're saying it'll be very safe, it'll be modular, it'll be very, very cheap. Hey, that'd be wonderful. We don't know. There's guys like Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000. Mm-hmm. He's arguing we should find, and he's looking for these small algae that you can put out on the ocean surface, and they'll take up sunlight and CO2 and create oil. and then you'll process that oil, you'll put it into your tank, you'll burn the oil, just like nothing had happened, but because it just took up the CO2, it'll be CO2 neutral. Again, all of these things I've just mentioned, and many, many more, they don't work right now because they're too expensive, or we can't quite figure out how to do them to scale, or whatever. The point is, there are hundreds and hundreds of those ideas. Let's spend research money on getting just one of them to get past the post.
Yeah.
Because if we can find one energy source that is cheaper than fossil fuels, we're done. Everyone will switch, not just rich, well-meaning Americans, but Chinese, Indians, Africans, everybody else. So the trick here is to recognize, if you're going to fix this problem, sure, there are other ways we can do that, and I also talk about those in the book, but the fundamental point is technology. Just like with a catalytic converter, if we don't have a solution that's easy to do and that's cheaper to do, you're going to have a hard time getting everyone to do it. If you have it cheaper, we've solved it.
Well, I've actually looked into the scenarios, and by watching movies, I've learned that if you have an American who demands it, who digs deeper, they can by themselves solve the whole world's problem. I'm having a little.
That's what I learned from movies as well. Yes.
If only an American was there. I've done a lot of podcasts about technology. I had a show called Popping the Bubble, and you're right, like just the 100,000 entrepreneurs that are all trying to solve one aspect of a problem. It might be an adjacent problem, but there's just they're going to continually get better at this. The software engineers are going to continually close the gap on all these things, and we're going to have not just one big problem. Most likely, it'll just be a confluence of 10,000 things that help us to gain better control. And we'll have a new list. Turns out we're going to have a new list of problems. Like now it's, I know you've talked about this in the past, but I remember this too, like the coming ice age. That'll become a reality again, and we'll be trying to warm things up. But we have Bob Taylor from Taylor Guitars on the show, and he talked about their care for the environment and how they source their wood, like their ebony and all these other things. And it's hyper important to them to be socially conscious and aware, and to take sequestered carbon and turn it into guitars. So like they have all these old trees in LA that they cut down. Instead of burning them, let's turn them into tables, into countertops, into guitars, and all these other things as we try to sequester carbon. There's a lot of people that are passionate about this, and it's on the capitalist side. Like, we want to have an environmentally conscious product, and you just can't replace that entrepreneurial spirit and innovation in terms of making a difference in 1,000 different places. You would never think guitars could save the world, but they're doing their little portion of it.
Yes, but again, and I'm sorry to rain on that parade. We also need to get a sense of proportion.
Yes,
obviously,
yes.
A lot of the things that we're going to be doing can have a tiny impact. But actually, I have a whole chapter, as you've probably seen, on why you can't fix global warming.
Right.
The fact that you drive a little less, or that you eat a little less meat, or so on, they're all nice. Please, by all means, do it. But don't believe that that's going to fix global warming. And we know that because we've just done that with the coronavirus. We basically shut down the entire world. When China was the most shut down on April 17th, they still emitted 78% of what they'd normally do. Because you still have to live, you still have to heat your house, you still have to do all these other things. Yeah. So even if we did all of this, it would only solve a smaller part of the problem. And of course, we're not going to keep on doing this. We want to get back out and fly and drive and all that other stuff. So the reality is, we have to get the technology that'll actually enable us to do all the stuff we want. And of course, allow the 5 or 6 billion other people who want to be just as well off as you and I am, to be able to do all of these things, but without emitting all the CO2. And that's about technology.
Yeah, and I only have you for about another 90 seconds. So I just wanted to say, the other thing is that we're getting better with the energy we have. Petrochemicals they're and if you have to understand thermodynamics, and maybe there'll be a fourth law, or technically a fifth law, that will come out. But without understanding that premise, you can't just invent, you can't ignore the 4 laws of thermodynamics, and solve this problem. There's just no way.
No, I mean, look, globally, you got to find a way that is actually compatible to human behavior. And for the last 30 years, we've been trying to say, let's fix global warming by telling everyone to go backwards. No, that's not going to work. It hasn't worked, predictably, and it's not going to work. But if we can get the technology right, And if we can stop being so scared, we can fix climate change through investing a lot more in research and development. It'll still be much cheaper than what we're spending just on solar and wind subsidies. And then, of course, also remember, if we stop being so scared, we can actually start to remember all the other problems in the world that we also need to fix.
Yeah, by the way, other big problems. Hey, get Bjorn's book, False Alarm, at Amazon. There's a link there. It's fantastic. 5-star rating for me. I love it. Thank you so much. And next time you have something to talk about, come on, you've got an open mic. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.